Turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. This is Susan Jakes. Welcome to our second in our series of Community Resource Economic Development webinars. This is Shoestring Evaluation, Measuring CRED Impacts with Limited Resources. So we're so glad you could join us today. My name is Susan Jakes. I'm from NC State University, and I'm one of the team. Here we have a list of our other team members. You can see we're kind of scattered all across the U.S., and we try to represent both USA and NIFA, but we're really a grassroots group of mostly program leaders, evaluation specialists, other people that work in extension that really care about community resource economic development and evaluation. Here's just a quick map to show how we're kind of spread out across the US. What we're really trying to do as a team, we've come together, we just kind of bubbled up with people from the different regions that were interested in doing this work, is we want to really gather and assess the impacts that we're having across our universities so we can leverage each other's strengths, really communicate those impacts nationally, help people understand what we do and what impact it's making on our communities. We really want to support the work of community resource economic development programming, and we want to really use all of those things together to make strategic decisions regarding the importance, value, and the potential of our programs. And lastly, we have here our 2016 goals. I'm not going to read these to you in the interest of time, but we really are working as a group to develop a plan that's ongoing. We've been doing this for, I would say, 3 to 4 years. It's kind of evolved over the years to have a more formal structure. But we want to have goals that really promote the work, continue the work, and build the work across the country. This is a kind of a hard task of thinking about how do we assess impact indicators for all the diversity of efforts that we have in communities across the country. So it's been a great learning experience for me as a participant in that work, and hopefully will really contribute to your work. And to begin that contribution to this work, today we have our webinar. Again, as I said, this is the second in the series of webinars. We'll be hosting them quarterly. So the next one has not been planned and named, so we'll get that information out to you soon. But today we have Charlie French and Casey Hancock. Charlie leads the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension's Community and Economic Development Program. Its mission is to cultivate civic leaders, foster participation in community decision-making, strengthen entrepreneurial skills, and help communities grow the local and regional economy. He serves on both the National Evaluation Working Group, which is this working group, and is also really helping regionally to help UNH Cooperative Extension expand its evaluation capacity. Last fall, he and Scott Chaston piloted ripple effect mapping, which is a qualitative approach to evaluating program impacts that we had our last webinar, and he did that work in Panama. So that's really exciting. They're taking it international. Secondly, we have Casey Hancock. Casey is the Community Development Program Coordinator at UNH Extension. She coordinates the program called Extension's Community Profiles Visioning Program. She also provides information and assistance to communities, partners, groups, clientele, as she supports her program team's efforts to evaluate the impacts of community development programs. Casey has a passion for working with communities to strengthen the local food system and provide educational programming to encourage economic development through tourism. So we're really excited to have this presentation today. And at the end, I want to give us one more piece of information before I let you go, Charlie. So if you scroll back up to the top of your chat box, about the fourth chat down, there's a link. If you do need to leave the presentation early for some reason and don't get a chance to go to the evaluation, there's a link right there to the evaluation. And if you get to stay for the whole presentation, then it will pop up on your screen as the presentation ends and you begin to close out. So thank you so much, and we're really looking forward to this, Charlie and Casey. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Susan. So I'm Charlie French. As Susan said, I lead the Cooperative Extension's Community and Economic Development Program in New Hampshire. Just as a little bit of background, about 15 years ago when I started, we were a 2-person program, and we've been fortunate enough to grow to 12 people, and we're still growing, in fact. And a lot of that has been a result of the fact that we've been able to document our impacts of our work. So I also want to give Casey Hancock, my colleague, a chance to say hi too.
Thank you for the introduction, Susan. I'm Casey Hancock, and I've been with UNH Cooperative Extension for about a year now, coming from North Carolina Cooperative Extension, where I worked as a local foods and community development extension agent. My responsibilities have shifted a little bit here at UNH to really focus on our community development programs, having some programmatic responsibilities, as well as some kind of back-end marketing, evaluation, and database management.
So it was the National Evaluation Working Group that first invited us to do this webinar. Actually, I think I might have proposed presenting this. And I came up with the title Shoestring Evaluation, meaning that we're doing evaluation work here in New Hampshire with little in the way of resources, no budget, very little expertise, no evaluation specialist, and it's really not built into our work plan. So it's something that I'm sure that all of you face, trying to document the impacts of our work, which our directors are always asking for, but not really having the tools and resources to be able to do that effectively. Well, when I did a little bit of research, I actually found that there's actually a body of literature on shoestring evaluation. So just wanted to clarify that we're not meaning anything clinical by it. We just really are talking about evaluation with little in the way of resources. So I guess there are a couple of scenarios under which all of us probably have to do shoestring evaluation in the sense that we're meaning it. It's oftentimes we are asked to do evaluation work, but it's after a program has already begun. And so we really don't have the opportunity to collect that baseline information to be able to gauge our progress on it. Or in some cases, we don't have the resources to be able to do that. And nor do we have the resources to be able to collect data on control groups and such, or do these complicated statistical studies. So our approach has been to really make evaluation simple and to draw from the vast resources that are out there in the country from others that are doing evaluation work of community resource and economic development programs. So we've begged, borrowed, and stolen from others to be able to craft our plan. So want to start this off. We want to make this as interactive as possible. If you could use your chat box and just type in what you find most challenging about program evaluation in your state, regardless of what programming you come from. Would just be really curious, and maybe in the end we can circle back to talk about some of the challenges. So type in the chat box what you perceive to be some of the biggest challenges about program evaluation. So I guess we'll kick off the formal part of the presentation by talking a little bit about the logic model. The logic model is kind of your theory of change. It's how you test the theory of how the inputs that you are putting into your work as well as the outputs lead to whatever the outcomes that you're desiring. Oftentimes where we fail is that we don't pick the right indicators in terms of measuring those outputs. And it's my belief that we make logic models too complicated. So I'm going to propose a new logic model. Whoops, sorry, I have to go back here. So here's the new logic model for us. So this is obviously tongue-in-cheek, but give us money and we all win. And again, this goes back to the fact that sometimes logic models are really complicated to follow. And if it's complicated, it's probably unlikely that we're, as programmers, going to be following that logic model. It's not something that we can keep in our heads. And also, we like to think of the logic model as a communication tool. We think of a logic model as a way of describing our program to someone else. So keeping it easy to understand is very important. So the logic model is kind of the basis for all of our evaluation work that we do. And we'll talk a little bit about that evaluation work. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Casey Hancock here to talk a little bit about how we collect data.
Thanks, Charlie. So the first way that we begin to collect evaluation data is through post-event process surveys through Qualtrics. And this is just really an easy way to implement surveys, and it's very low cost. We do this for all of our programs. And the way that we kind of organize questions within these surveys are 4 different categories. The first being satisfaction, or how participants like the program. The second being knowledge and skills, to kind of assess what participants learned, what skills did they gain, and then taking charge, how likely are participants to take action, to do something, to use the knowledge or skills that they just attained. The last being general demographics, just some basic questions for our reporting. Now, surveys are a good first step in evaluation, helps us evaluate how well we're running our programs, if participants are happy, if they're learning, but really need to follow through with longer term evaluation instruments to really figure out what the outcomes are. To give you an example, for our community visioning programs, we usually do 3 different surveys for 3 groups of people. The first being our community participants who attended the workshop. The second being our steering committee who kind of helped plan the event. And then our facilitators and scribes who volunteered to participate, because each one of those groups has different learning outcomes and goals.
So as Casey pointed out, really these post-process surveys are really intended to capture the short-term outcomes of really how did the process work for people, did it meet their expectations and such, and that those include the general participants as well as members of the steering committee and such. We also find it very important to survey participants of our community visioning processes. We're using that as an example. We oftentimes do 2 surveys. We do a survey 1 year out from the process, from the forum when people come together as a community, and then we do one 2 to 5 years out. And really the goal of our follow-up surveys is less about whether the process meets people's expectations, and it's more about understanding what participants perceive to be the most important outcomes from the process. So we oftentimes incorporate some generic questions into those surveys, so we have some data on all the communities that we work with, but we also tailor some of the questions for the specific community, because the community visioning process itself identifies what some of the projects are. So we may ask specific questions that gauge people's perceptions about the outcomes related to that project. One of the interesting things that we've learned in doing these surveys is that typically at the event itself, what people perceive to be the most important outcomes tend to be the bricks and mortar type things. It's building a community center, a new pool, or maybe cleaning up a park. Those tend to be the things that people can resonate with during the forum itself. But when we do particularly the long-term survey work 2 to 5 years out, what we find is that the most important outcomes are really the social outcomes. It's the ability for the community to generate new opportunities for people to come together. Maybe it's sort of this idea of building social capital. Those things are actually more important, what we find in the longer term, to communities than the bricks and mortar things. Those bricks and mortar things oftentimes either A, they're not attainable because they're too expensive and they realize they're not feasible to get done, or oftentimes the community actually gets those done, and maybe those get done in the first year or 2. But they realize that the social outcomes are really what bind the community together in the long term.
All right, so interviews are another tool for mid-long-term outcomes. And just to tell a little story, we completed a community visioning project last April in Franklin, New Hampshire, and this project really centered around the idea of aging in place, and a lot of issues around economic development came up. So following this 2.5-day workshop, action groups were created with community members on those action groups working to accomplish different projects in the community. And we still have a UNH staff member attending meetings and supporting those action groups to hear updates. But what was really great was we decided to do a video project about engagement, and decided to go up to Franklin to interview some steering committee members as well as community members. And we were really lucky to hear a lot of really great stories. Community members talked about feeling like their voices were heard, and not only heard, but actions were taken. A steering committee member talked about how there were a lot of false starts in Franklin, how momentum started and sustained through the Franklin for a Lifetime project. and really resulted in tangible things. Another really great story from a steering committee member who actually started a coffee shop just after the Franklin for a Lifetime workshop, and she talked about how she knew that she really wanted to open this coffee shop in Franklin and have a space for community, and she just felt like the time was right after Franklin. It just opened the space for her to be able to be successful. And then the stories kept on coming and coming of, 2 other businesses that also wanted to relocate and start in Franklin, and, a lot of great stories there. And, you could go and do these interviews yourself. Another great way to get some good quotes from people is just following news articles. Franklin is constantly in the news, and we're lucky to be able to read about it and hear more stories.
And just a reference to the slide here, when we did this visioning process in Franklin, we had a design charrette. And based on the input provided by people in the community, this was a rendition of what their town could look like in the future. And it's kind of a far cry from what it looks like now, but they envisioned a public space where people could have music nights and lots of places where people could bump elbows. So that's kind of a baseline in some respects. We can sort of gauge whether in 2 to 3 years they've achieved that outcome. Want to talk a little bit about some work that we're doing here in the Northeast. Both the North Central region and the Southern region have been really good about collecting impact data for community and economic development programming. And both of those regions have really coalesced around a series of impact indicators that they collect data at the regional level on. It's not to say that every state collects data on all of those impact indicators, but what it does is provides great fodder for creating a regional impact statement, as the North Central and Southern regions have done. And I think that's gotten a lot of positive play at the federal level in Washington. Now, I think the Northeast region and the Western region are a little bit behind that, but we're also getting organized around this. And we have on the call here George Morris, who's helping to spearhead a project here in the Northeast where we have, I believe, 6 states who have identified a set of 4 or 5 common indicators that we agreed to collect data on. And each of the states is at least going to try and collect data on a few of those. And this has really helped us to galvanize around some common indicators. I applied this graph that you see here is basically data that we've collected from Franklin from the previous slide. Of course, we've done it for all of the communities that we've worked in, but this is just to give you an example. We count the number of participants who are reporting new leadership roles in their community. Some of this data is collected through interviews with the participants after. In some cases, we learn that through the post survey. And in some instances, we read about people taking on new leadership roles in newspaper clippings and in town meeting minutes and such. So we keep track of that as best as we can. We also learned through post-process interviews that 3 new businesses have already been created as a result of this visioning process. 4 jobs have been created or expanded. And then the community has pursued a number of grants to leverage its economic development resources. And in fact, they hired a new economic development director for the town who started a couple weeks ago as a result of this process. So this table, it really helps us to aggregate our data and then to compare it with other states and then come up with sort of a regional snapshot of what our collective impact as a region has been. Let me go to the next slide here. Okay,
so another tool for measuring outcomes are just simply to have follow-up meetings with the community. Another little story, we did a community profile in Barrington in April 2014, and about a year later, Barrington called and said, "Can we meet with you guys? Can we have a check-in? We're not sure if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of, moving along with projects identified at the profile and having action groups moving along." So we said sure, and we went and had a meeting, which was well attended by action group members as well as the original steering committee members. And after a few minutes, it was clear that the general consensus was that they hadn't done much. So we asked the group to go around and share what they'd been working on, and I was amazed at all that they had accomplished in one short year. And it just seemed as though the group needed a little bit of affirmation that they were doing a good job, and we got an opportunity to learn about some of their accomplishments. One specific thing the lifelong learning group was working on was their original goal was to develop additional educational classes for lifelong learners in the community. And they thought that they had failed because they discovered that the library actually offered these free classes and worked to better market them, and ended up working with the librarian to discuss more possibilities for offering additional classes. So we call that a success. Another example, there was a group concerned about meeting space in the community, and their big project was that they created a document outlining all of the places to meet in the community. And the list goes on. So we learned a lot just from that one follow-up meeting, that we have decided to kind of build in a one-year follow-up meeting with communities, whether it's informal like the one in Barrington, or maybe we decide to implement some ripple effect mapping during those meetings, but really a great success.
And I think the lesson here is that just because people in a community don't embark on this huge project doesn't mean that they're not successful. If they can indeed solve a problem or get to an end outcome that they had envisioned in a simpler way, such as working with the library to do something, then that's indeed a powerful outcome. And we sometimes have to help community participants recognize that that's something that they made happen. And they can focus on something else, which is sort of where we are with Barrington. We're trying to get them to focus on other things that they can do in the community. So we've talked about just a few ways of collecting data that we try to incorporate. But I think we sort of alluded to these a little bit, but there are lots of ways that you can collect data and information from a community. And sometimes I find to be the most helpful or fruitful is doing simple document review. So we sometimes hire interns to really mine the minutes of communities that have undergone a community visioning process, or any program for that matter, to find out if it's come up in planning board meetings or other meetings, to see if the community is actually moving forward some of the vision components that the visioning process identified. But we also mine local papers, and there are lots of different sources at the local level that you can look at to see if anything's coming up that's related to the process that you conducted. Now, this is a little bit premature to talk about ripple effect mapping, because we actually have not yet used ripple effect mapping in the context of our programs, particularly the community visioning program. But I did get the opportunity, as Susan said, to travel to Panama to test this ripple effect mapping in 2 rural communities in Panama who are doing work with sustainable food systems. Why not pick a great place to go if you're going to pilot it? So it was a really exciting process, and I think that it's got great potential to use for community visioning processes. And we probably will do this process in Barrington, in the town that Casey was talking about. So, all right, we're going to switch gears a little bit again. Actually, before we get to marketing, Rachel, if you could, we wanted to make this interactive, and I probably should have done this earlier, but we have a polling question that we wanted to put out to you. And that polling question really is having to do with, do you use surveys to collect information after workshops and programs? So if you folks could just complete this. This is just kind of to give us a sense of what level of evaluation you folks are doing. Well, it looks like we've got most of the input in, and over 90% of you, at least at the basic level of collecting input after you've implemented a program or process. So that's pretty good. I think that's really good. I think the trick is to sort of scale that up and do the longer term evaluation work, which I'm sure that many of you do. And we probably should have had another question in there. How many of you do that longer term evaluation type work? But that might be part of the discussion questions that we bring up in the end. So now we're going to switch and talk a little bit about marketing and communicating.
So communicating impacts. So once the good data is collected, how should it be shared? I think it should be shared and presented in a compelling, easy to digest way. And infographics are a great way to do this. This is an example infographic recapping a key stakeholders forum as part of UNH Cooperative Extension Strategic Plan. It has a really nice mix of pictures, text, as well as graphs and icons, visually appealing. Just a nice, nice piece to be able to give a stakeholder and show them what you're up to.
And considering this is something that we developed ourselves and we didn't hire some professional to do it, so it was within our limited graphics capability. So.
Yes, absolutely. Another example of an infographic, this one shows the impact of extension volunteers in 2015. Again, takes a lot of numbers but puts it into a nice, easy to read and understand document. And those icons, if you're interested in good quality icons, you could check out thenounproject.com or Shutterstock. It's really easy to search for different icons just by word, and you can find some nice stuff to kind of spice up your graphic work. And this was another one that was done in-house as well. And the last one is an example of an infographic showing impacts and highlights specifically in a county. So this has been created for each of the 10 counties in New Hampshire, kind of shows the 4 program areas, and then on the flip side is actually a nice narrative. So tells some stories, has some hard numbers. Again, I think it's visually appealing. People seem to like them, and stakeholders seem to respond to them well. They really want to see things split by their county, especially.
This kind of has a Rube Goldberg feel to it. You know, I wish we had shown the other side. Casey made a good point that these are just numbers. These really are, you know, at best short-term impacts. It's the narratives which really help us to really capture the meaning of those impacts of the actual work on participants in the community. So on the flip side of this, which we send to each of our counties each year, it has some really good narratives that talk about specific cases and successes. So I think it's really important to mesh the numerical piece with the narrative piece, that people learn in different ways, and you have to convey both if you're trying to communicate a message. And lastly, I think we'll just talk about some of the key takeaways that we have from this. So the first takeaway is that, you know, you really should build, to the extent that you can, you should bake evaluation into the programming. When we think about the community visioning process, the community profiles program, there are many points in the process itself that are actually getting us baseline data. And when we meet with the action committees, we're actually collecting data on what those committees are doing. So to that degree, we are actually sort of the evaluation components built into the process. We certainly do surveys and other things, but to the extent that you can use the process itself to give you good information, it's always helpful.
Absolutely. The next key takeaway is don't try to measure everything. Really important, I think, to start small and figure out what questions you're really trying to answer. More data is not necessarily better, and you know, in line with that, it's important to keep your evaluation instruments brief and to the point so that participants will want to participate.
And just as a side note, this picture here is, I believe it's from the 1940s, with a national health survey that was done, and this is all the data that was collected. So have fun making meaning of all that data. So the other piece that we talk about avoiding the black box of reporting. I know many states have reporting systems that you enter numbers into, but it's oftentimes hard to know where those numbers go. And any reporting system, if it's going to have true value, it should actually have value not just to the person that you're reporting to, if it's the federal government or if it's your state legislature. It should also have meaning for those people that are inputting the data. In other words, it should have some way to interact with that reporting system so that you can get a context of the impact of the work that you're doing. It should spit out reports. It should help you to aggregate data, to pull up quick quotes and excerpts. And I think that sometimes we forget when we build reporting systems that it has to be user-friendly and it has to have value back to the person who's entering data. Otherwise, it's just a black box.
Another important point is kind of in line with my last point, to be clear on outcomes and impacts. So oftentimes, as Charlie mentioned in the beginning, our logic models are so complex and there's a lot of jargon in there, to be honest, and we struggle with looking at the long-term outcomes. Are they really measurable? So be sure that you know what you're trying to measure and make sure that what you're trying to measure is measurable. So just be clear.
And then the last piece that we want to speak to is having common indicators across programs. We have a number of areas of expertise. Each of these areas of expertise are essentially teams that are focusing on specific topics. But oftentimes they have a tendency to each have their own indicators that they're measuring against. And what you end up having are within an organization, dozens and dozens of indicators that speak to different things. And that's good, but to the extent that you can actually build in indicators that span your programming functions is really helpful to be able to tell a larger collective story, especially if we talk about our impacts on the economy. I think about, we do work with communities around economic development. Our ag folks, or particularly our ag business folks, are doing work helping to improve the vitality of small farms. Our forestry folks are helping forest industries and local forest economies. So to the extent that you can find indicators that speak to all of these areas is really helpful to tell a broader story. So, and the last thing I should probably add in here, we want to be authentic about this. So I should note that we just hired a program development and evaluation specialist who I notice is actually on this call here. I can no longer call our evaluation Shoestring evaluation, because we indeed have someone who's going to help us through this process. But it took us a while to get here, and we're very thankful that now we have someone. It doesn't mean that we don't have work cut out for us, because this person's not going to do our evaluation for us. He's going to help us all do evaluation better. So with that, I think that about wraps it up for what we wanted to present. We've looked at some of the challenges that you folks spoke of. I think one of the things that came up a couple of times is that folks don't have the resources or the expertise to be able to evaluate the impacts of programs. I think one person said that it's hard to get staff to buy into it, especially if you're in a state that doesn't necessarily have a program leader and your program is somewhat diffuse. It's hard to, who's going to be the champion that's going to corral that effort? Someone indicated that it's hard to get consensus on what we're trying to measure. And so those are just some of the things that kind of popped up. But I'm curious to look back at some of that information to see what others perceive as challenges. So let's see, I'm trying to read the questions here.
Chat box.
A question about where the graphics came from. And actually, I'll let Susan, you can moderate the questions for us. Thank you.
Well, I was just going to say that was a question. So, and what program did your, no, not to design the survey, but which program was used for the in-house sheets on impacts?
I think some of them were used InDesign, which is a little bit more complex, but I also have a colleague that is very successful at using PowerPoint for infographics. You know, the simpler the better if you're already familiar with PowerPoint. Pretty simple to do.
And the communications piece that sort of had that Rube Goldberg feel with the mechanical hand holding the watering can, that was actually done by our communications director, who's not a designer by trade, by the way, but he put that together for us, and he did it in 10 counties.
So also in the chat box, Alda's noted some of the resources we talked about. She gave a website for Qualtrics for the survey design, the Noun project, and also a third one she just suggested, PicoChart is a good one for infographics. So you can find those in your chat box if you scroll through. If anybody has other questions, you can just post them in your chat box. And if we've missed something, if you can repost it, that would be very helpful too. Thanks.
Yeah. And actually, if folks have questions, I should put my email was probably in there somewhere, but I'll type my email and Casey's email in here, so you can reach us if you have any questions. Okay. So there are our emails.
Looks like we still have some more folks typing. Here we go. Is it possible to get a copy of the infographic for the counties that include all program areas?
Yes, it is definitely possible. I probably won't be able to access the link immediately because I'd have to search for it. But I can try and get that by the end of the session, and I can put it in here. If not, Rachel and Susan, do we have a way to get back to the participants somehow? How would we communicate the link to those infographics to folks?
If you're okay with it, we could just link it with your PowerPoint. Whenever we put the PowerPoint up and we put the recording up, we could also just link to that if that's okay with you. It'll be on the rrdc.info site. I'll drop that in.
That sounds great. Perfect.
We also have a couple more suggestions in the chat box for other tools that you can use. Walt is offering offers.hubspot.com, how to create infographics in PowerPoint, to explain how to do that. And Alda also, oh no, I already said picture. Sorry about that. I was thinking there was another one.
So I see a question from Carl. How do we develop a group of regional or national indicators that are relevant, accurate, and collected in a consistent manner? Well, I think that's probably the million-dollar question. I think this is something that the four regions have been really struggling with because the work looks different by region, and maybe the challenges look different. So I think we found some that we find relevant in our own state. And so I guess I keep going back to we can't expect, if we come up with 15 common indicators nationally or regionally, we can't expect that they're going to be relevant to each individual, but surely there's going to be some common ground.
And George Morris is asking, any luck in convincing educators that their programs have great public value to other communities if they evaluate and share their results?
Yeah, that's a good question. I find that it's important in my position as a program leader. That's a message that I'm always taking out to, particularly the educators at the county level, sort of conveying exactly how that information makes its way to other channels, how we use it with the legislature, how it matters when we meet with administrators at the university level. So as long as we show to them exactly how we use the information, I think we've had pretty good success getting buy-in when people actually see their information being used. And we always are very careful to run things by the county staff to make sure that we're not changing the meaning of something. So we're trying to be transparent and communicative with our staff. So.
I also didn't kind of pass up the opportunity to invite anybody that is on this call that's interested in this work. And Carl, your question kind of spurs this thought. And Jenna, also your response. We always welcome more people to join this national team. So if you're interested in joining the national team, anybody that's on one of that first slide that we had up that listed all of our names, some of us are here today on the webinar, but feel free to email us. And so you'll see the link to those names when the slides come out. So please join us. We need your expertise and help because, as people have said in the chat, it's a $1 million effort.
And thank you, Diane, for finding our link to the impact pages. You found it faster than we did. So. Thank you. So we hope
Okay.
we don't disappoint people by ending early either. So
I was going to say, I'm not seeing any more questions. So George says, when this is archived, do the chats and links show? I don't think the chat is scrollable. Is it, Rachel, when it's archived?
No, I don't think that you'll be able to read that. I am recording the chat, and so we can put those links up so that people can at least have access to all of that. And I do want just to remind everybody before you climb off of here that we will have a survey pop up, so please don't close your browser. It should just pop up when we close the session, and it'll only take you a minute or two, but we'd love to get your input.
So Scott's asking a question. Can we talk a bit about civic engagement? Your narratives really point towards people getting engaged in the community. Any ideas for metrics coming from your work?
well, Scott, that was actually something that we're hoping to talk with you more about. And this is something that our evaluation person at the University of New Hampshire is hopefully going to be able to help us with. We've been measuring, looking at new people taking on leadership roles. Right now, that's really one of the main indicators that we've collected. But we do want to think about other ways of capturing this idea of civic engagement. Indicators such as the number of community events that bring people together, the number of opportunities at the local level for people to rub elbows, public parks. And I think there are lots of different things that we can look at. We just have not yet settled on what that indicator of civic engagement is. And we also track, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
We track participation. We look at, when we do a visioning process, we look at how many people participated in the original, the forum, and we look at how the community participants stay engaged throughout the process, at say 6 months, a year, and a year and a half out.
Okay, I just lost it in the scroll. Can you review who is reporting number of jobs created? Is this a stakeholder groups you mentioned, participant steering team and facilitators? And then she asks a second later, and then how do you deduplicate, if at all?
Well, we're fortunate in we have a small enough team so that when we collect impact data, we assign particular people to collect data for specific either indicators or for specific processes. So we don't have multiple people collecting data on a single intervention or program that we're doing. But we also sort of use the but-for clause. After we do a program, let's say it's a business retention and expansion program, and this program has reached out to X number of businesses, we try and follow up with those businesses in an interview setting to find out if indeed the program that they underwent or that they were reached out to by community members had an impact on their ability to sustain jobs, create jobs, or sustain their business. So we actually ask the direct stakeholders for that information. So we have it directly from them. So. And George puts in his note that it's we use the attribution principle, which is kind of what I was speaking to. And good, Walt has a list of formative indicators for around community engagement that he's still working to refine. So I would, these are excellent questions, and I don't want to portray Casey or myself as experts in this field. This is something that we've had to pick up on our own. So we've tried to reach out to other resources to help us do this, and we've done a lot of pretty extensive research to find out if there are valid tools out there. But we are, I would say, we're still a long ways off from doing a very comprehensive, effective job at measuring the impacts of our work. What we can do is collect data on a few items and then weave a story around that by collecting narratives through interviews and other mechanisms too.
So Mary mentioned in the chat box, I've been looking at the CET Civic Healthy Index also in terms of ideas for civic engagement. Mary, can you post a link to that?
And that reminds me of something that a few years ago, we developed a tool that we began to use in New Hampshire. We called it the Community Capacity Assessment Tool. And essentially, it's a web-based survey tool that we would have a steering committee for, say, a visioning process complete together while they're all in the same room. And it was broken up into, I think, 5 or 6 sections. And one looked at measuring a community's existing capacity for civic engagement. Another looked at transportation infrastructure. Another looked at the environment. So we had those particular areas, and it was essentially a baseline survey. We would do a pre and a post to see if we could document any numerical changes in a community's capacity in a particular area. And the questions under each survey were essentially indicator questions that we devised. So, and we got help from folks. Robert Putnam's group at Harvard to help us validate some of the survey instruments. But we don't use that tool as much anymore because it was we felt it was too long. But I'm happy to share a link to that tool as I see someone ask for a copy of that.
You also see in the chat box that Mary's posted the link to the CT Healthy Communities, I think it was called, index. So it's another resource. And again, we'll pull all these resources out of the chat and make them available when we send out and post information on this webinar.
And Susan, I see that Paul Pope asked what have been your response rates for using Qualtrics, and I'll let Casey speak to that.
Okay. So I think our response rates are somewhere in the range of 30 to 40%. Which we're working on, and we've learned some good lessons along the way. You know, we had an instance where we were working in a community and we allowed the community to do the registration and they did not get anyone's email address. So we learned that the hard way. You know, we're exploring other ways to increase response rates by possibly bringing iPads to a program if it was small enough and letting people use the offline survey function on an iPad, trying to get away from paper surveys and keep everything online. But there's definitely room for improvement there.
That's funny because I keep going back to paper surveys and Casey keeps pushing me towards the electronics. So.
A little less work with and not having to enter data with the online versions.
We do have a couple more people typing. Again, Rachel just posted in the chat box a link to the survey if you can fill that out quickly if you need to hop off.
And while folks are typing in stuff, I just want to thank all of you for joining. We had a pretty good turnout. Casey and I didn't know what to expect. We thought we'd get 12 people who are interested in evaluation, but clearly this is something that all of your states are grappling with. So I'm glad we're not the only ones sort of struggling in trying to find our way through this. So.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. See another question about the Qualtrics link being sent immediately after the program and follow up to non-respondents. Yes, so most of our programs are over the weekend and we try to have that link out to them with a little thank you email on the Monday following. We usually give them a week to fill it out and then give another reminder to respond with a hard deadline. We found that works really well. To send them a reminder and say, it's going to be closed Friday afternoon, close of business. And we actually see a large amount of people responding right at that deadline.
And Miles asks a question, and I'll try and answer it. I think George Morris, who's on this webinar, would probably be the best person to speak to it. But he says, tell a little bit more about the but-for and attribution principle. And again, I can only speak to it in the context of our business retention and expansion program. We have specific goals for that program, and obviously those goals are to grow jobs, retain businesses, and expand businesses, which ties to the growing jobs piece. So after we've implemented the program, that involves community members interviewing and surveying a sample of businesses within the community. And at the end of the business retention and expansion program, the hope is that the community will have articulated and crafted a series of actions or projects aimed at addressing some of the issues and challenges facing the businesses, whether it's developing workforce development program through the VOTEC institutions, or whether it's something regulatory, something simple that the town can do to make sort of a one-stop shop permitting, at least someone that can guide businesses through that. We go out to those businesses that were interviewed and we ask them if those projects and activities had an impact on them, and if those impacts actually helped them to sustain jobs, grow jobs, or expand their business in any way. And we try and ask the questions in multiple ways. I don't have the questions at hand, but it's something that we're trying to validate directly with the businesses.
So it looks like that question is about the reminder to fill out the Qualtrics survey. And yes, the reminder is sent out to everyone through a generic link. All the answers are completely anonymous. So we don't know who's filled it out or has not. Yeah, that's a great point about, online surveys experiencing a drop in response rates. I think working, if you had a really important evaluation that you needed to get done, consider incentivizing. You might offer a gift card or something like that if people were to participate. Something that we've also considered is, because we have 3 different evaluations, the one for the steering committee, we also came into a situation where it was like pulling teeth to get steering committee members who we worked with for over a year to fill out an evaluation, which is a little bit frustrating. So putting that in the MOU, everyone has to respond to this anonymous survey evaluation is another good way. For participants, convincing them to participate, that's another story, and it's a challenge. If you have any advice, type it in the box.
maybe we should charge communities X amount and then refund them a quarter if they complete the evaluation. So. That was sort of tongue-in-cheek, by the way.
So Scott is suggesting in the chat box that he gets a good response rate if they are continually engaged with the participant in some way. So they send out a monthly newsletter, if they send out postcards that check in, etc. So I think that's a good tip.
Yeah,
definitely.
And Shannon's asking, do I need to include my email to get a link to the recorded webinar? So we will send out the recording with kind of our email blast that eventually got to you, Shannon, that posts information about these webinars, but it's also going to be posted on the regional rural development website. And can you post up a link to that again, Rachel? Do you mind?
Yeah, just put it in there.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm not scrolling.
And look for the but-for attribution principle paper that George Morris is involved in drafting. So that'll be good. We're all looking forward to that, George. There's a lot of good evaluation stuff coming out of Minnesota. Does that have anything to do with you, Scott? No. And as I said before, we're happy to take questions offline and share things as well. So.
Well, thank you so much for all of your insights. And I think the question and answer was the most fun to me. Just you can really dig into what you all know and the depth of kind of living the work that you all do in your community. So thank you so much. This is a great webinar, a great kickoff for our second webinar, and we look forward to the next one coming up. So we'll be sending the information out kind of as we sent this one out. I think I received the notice about 6 times in my inbox, so that says it's getting around there. People said, you might be interested in this, and I was like, I am, alas. So again, please do fill out the quick survey. It should take you about a minute when you log off today. And if you go to that RRDC